abandoned by his parents due to Down syndrome. But they didn't know he was watching. The room was quiet. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. He could feel the cold metal of the hospital bed beneath him. His small hands gripped the thin blanket. His heart raced. Something didn't feel right. Where were they? The footsteps had faded. His parents were supposed to be here. He waited. The door was slightly ajar. The world outside felt distant. Voices echoed down the hall. But they didn't belong to the people he knew. His eyes darted around the room. There was no one. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Every second dragged. His fingers curled into fists. He squinted at the white walls. Their sterile, lifeless color made the space feel colder. The sounds outside grew louder. Laughter. Murmurs. But it didn't feel like home. Where had they gone? A voice cut through the silence. A doctor entered. He smiled, but it wasn't comforting. "You're alone," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. His chest tightened. He couldn't understand. Why was she saying that? He pushed himself up, but his legs felt weak. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The doctor's smile faded. She took a step back. "You should lie down," she suggested gently. But he didn't want to lie down. He wanted answers. Tears welled up in his eyes. His fingers brushed his face, tracing the heat of his cheeks. The door clicked shut. His heart thudded louder. He could hear the rush of his breath. Where were they? The doctor had said it so calmly. Alone. He was alone. The world outside continued, indifferent. The sound of footsteps returned. They weren't his parents. They were strangers. Their voices too far away to recognize. But they weren't his. His chest tightened. He pressed his palms against his eyes. The room felt smaller. The emptiness grew. In the hallway, people passed by. Yet no one stopped. He called out, but his voice felt weak. The door remained closed. His world grew darker. And then, the sound of a key in the lock. A shadow crossed the doorway. But it wasn't them. His breath hitched. Fear gripped his throat. He couldn't move. The shadow didn't speak. It just watched. The room felt colder still. He wanted to scream, but his voice stayed trapped inside. What was happening? His parents had promised, hadn't they? But now, only the sound of breathing filled the space. His breath, and the shadows. It lingered, unseen but present. He couldn't escape. It was too late. They had left him behind. The weight of it settled deep in his chest. The shadow moved closer. Slowly, his heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He wanted to scream, but his voice had disappeared. The door creaked open wider. It wasn't just a shadow now. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall, unfamiliar. The silence was suffocating. The figure didn't speak. It just watched, its gaze cold and distant. His breath quickened, short gasps escaping his mouth. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything familiar. But there was nothing. No sign of his parents. No warmth. Only the unblinking eyes of the stranger in the doorway. The figure took a step forward, its shoes clicking sharply on the tile floor. Each click felt like a countdown. Closer. Closer. His stomach twisted into knots. The figure reached for something in its pocket. A small, folded piece of paper. It unfolded it slowly, deliberately. He watched with wide eyes. Every movement of the stranger amplified in the quiet. His pulse raced faster. What was going on? Why weren't they here? Why was he still alone? The figure glanced down at the paper, then back at him. Its lips parted, but no words came out. The silence stretched thick and heavy. The stranger's eyes never wavered. His throat felt tight, like a knot had formed inside. He swallowed, but it didn't help. The figure stepped closer, and then it reached out. A cold hand touched his shoulder. He flinched, his body freezing. A chill ran down his spine. The figure's grip was firm, unyielding. It didn't let go. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, suffocating. Why are you here?" he whispered, his voice barely a sound. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, without a word, it stepped back. The door closed, and the silence returned. But it wasn't the same. Now the silence was filled with a question. Where were they? He was still alone. The weight of his parents' absence pressed down on him, heavier than before. Had they forgotten him? Had they known all along? The room felt colder now. Empty. The air tasted stale, thick with fear. His fingers trembled, reaching for the edge of the bed. He needed to move, to do something, but his body was frozen. His mind raced with questions. Questions with no answers. Why had they left him? Why didn't they come back? The seconds stretched into minutes, then hours. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the hall again. But they didn't stop. The door remained shut. He felt the walls closing in, pressing against him, suffocating him. His throat tightened. He tried to breathe, but the air felt thick. A strange noise came from the corner of the room. A soft rustle. He turned his head sharply. There, in the shadowy corner, something moved. His heart skipped. His eyes strained, trying to make out what it was. A shape. A figure. It was small, crouched low to the floor. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. It moved again. Closer. Closer. He tried to push himself back, but the bed was too small, the space too tight. The figure stopped. Still. And then, a voice. A whisper. Don't be afraid. It was low, almost soothing, but it sent a jolt of panic through him. Who was it? He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He stared at the shape in the corner, his breath shallow and erratic. Who are you? He forced out, his voice trembling. The figure remained silent for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it stood up. A face appeared in the dim light. It wasn't the doctor. It wasn't anyone he knew. The eyes, cold, hollow, stared back at him. It took a step forward. He could feel his heart thumping, faster now. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. Why are you here? He gasped, his voice cracking. The figure's lips curled into something like a smile that didn't reach the eyes. It's not your time yet, the figure whispered, its voice strangely calm. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. The words echoed in his head. Not his time. What did that mean? The figure took another step forward. Closer. Closer. A shadow. A presence. Unstoppable. He could feel the coldness radiating from it. And then, a soft click. The door. The sound of it opening. It was real. The figure stopped. Still. Silent. The door creaked wider. A new presence filled the doorway. Someone familiar. His parents. But they weren't the same. They didn't look at him the way they once had. Their eyes vacant, distant, and the shadow beside him. It was gone. Just gone. His parents stood in the doorway, their faces blank. They didn't speak. They just stared. The room was suffocating with their silence.
He felt a chill run through him. His breath hitched. He wanted to call out, to reach for them, but his voice wouldn't come. The space between them felt impossibly wide. His parents didn't move. They didn't blink. He wanted to ask them why. Why had they left him? But no words formed. A heavy weight pressed down on his chest. His parents stepped into the room, their footsteps soft, but deliberate. Closer. Closer. They moved without expression, as though they were unaware of his gaze. His heart pounded faster. Each beat a hammer in his chest. The closer they came, the colder the room felt. Something wasn't right. They had abandoned him, left him alone, but now they were here. It didn't make sense. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, trapped in the bed. The world around him seemed to blur, like his mind couldn't grasp what was happening. His parents reached the foot of the bed, still silent. They hovered there. The air was thick with something unspoken. And then, just as he thought they might speak, his mother's hand reached out. Her fingers brushed his cheek. Cold. Ice cold. His breath stopped. He looked up into her eyes. But they weren't his mother's eyes. Not anymore. They were empty, hollow. Her face, once full of warmth and love, now seemed to be made of stone. He could feel his own pulse in his throat, strangling him. His father stood beside her, motionless, just watching. Watching him, with no recognition in their eyes. They weren't real. They couldn't be. Something in his gut told him that. Something dark and unsettling. A low hum vibrated through the room. It grew louder, closer. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift. He felt it again, the presence from before. It was still there. It was watching, waiting. But now, it was behind him. He didn't dare look. His body trembled, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figures, his parents, didn't speak. They didn't move. The coldness in the room grew unbearable. Then, his father reached forward, his hand slow and deliberate. It hovered just above his chest. His heart skipped a beat. The touch was cold. The chill burned. It spread through his skin like ice. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to flee, but his legs were paralyzed. His parents' cold hands hovered over him. And then, just as he thought he might pass out from the pressure, the door slammed shut. Suddenly, the room was pitch black. The darkness enveloped him, and in the deep, suffocating silence he heard it. A whisper, not from his parents, from somewhere else. "You can't escape." The whisper echoed in the darkness, a chilling promise. "You can't escape." His heart raced, pounding in his ears, drowning out all other sound. The cold was unbearable now. It wrapped around him, tighter, until he could hardly breathe. His skin felt like it was burning from the inside out. He tried to move, to scream, but his body was paralyzed. He was trapped. Trapped in the darkness, with no way out. The air was thick, like a weight pressing on his chest. He could feel someone moving around him, but he couldn't see them. Couldn't see anything. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You should have known." His breath caught. The words felt like they were inside his head, swirling through his thoughts. Should have known what? He wanted to scream, but the words stayed trapped in his throat. The temperature dropped even lower, if that was even possible. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, closing in on him, suffocating him. His fingers twitched. They moved slowly, desperately. He tried to push himself up, but the bed was no longer there. His hands met the cold, hard floor. The darkness swirled around him, like a living thing, a sentient fog that wouldn't let go. And then, from the edges of his vision, he saw something. A shape, a silhouette, a figure looming just beyond the reach of his sight. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its presence was overwhelming, a shadow that absorbed all light. It moved towards him, its footsteps silent. Closer, closer. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs were like lead. He couldn't escape. The figure stopped. It was right in front of him now. He could feel it, its coldness, its weight. The air thickened, pressing on him from every direction. And then, the whisper again, closer than ever. "You should have known. We never left." The voice was chilling, cold like ice, but with a strange, eerie tenderness. His stomach dropped. What did that mean? "We never left." His breath hitched. A sudden coldness gripped his chest. He felt something slide around his neck. A hand. Thin, cold fingers wrapped around his throat. He couldn't breathe. He gasped for air, but none came. His vision blurred, the world tilting, spinning around him. The figure's grip tightened. The darkness was overwhelming. The last thing he saw was a pair of hollow eyes, his parents' eyes. And then, everything went black. The darkness was thick, suffocating. It pressed in from all sides, smothering him. His lungs burned for air, but none came. His body was heavy, like it was sinking deeper into the blackness. The cold fingers around his neck tightened, pulling him further into the abyss. A rush of panic surged through him, but it was distant, muffled. Nothing made sense. He tried to fight, tried to claw at the invisible hand choking him, but his arms felt useless, weak. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The world around him was a swirling void, a place where nothing existed except the suffocating weight and the cold grip. The whisper came again, closer, closer than ever. You were never meant to be alone. The words slithered through the darkness, curling around his mind. He couldn't understand them. Why? What did it mean? The darkness seemed to laugh, its voice, distant yet present, echoing in his mind. His heartbeat was a drum in his ears, deafening, frantic. The grip around his throat loosened. He gasped for air, choking, desperate. The fingers, cold and sharp like ice, released him, but the chill remained, hanging in the air. He was free to breathe, but it wasn't over. The darkness didn't release its hold. He was still trapped, still sinking. But then, a light, a flicker, a weak, trembling glow. It pierced the endless blackness. He squinted, trying to focus on it, trying to move toward it. It was faint, distant, but it was there. He fought against the weight of the darkness, pushing himself forward. The coldness seemed to resist, tugging at him, pulling him back. But the light, he had to reach the light. His breath came in ragged gasps as he forced himself to crawl toward it. The light grew brighter, warmer, closer. He could feel the warmth now, radiating from it. It was the only thing real in this void. His hands reached for it, trembling, desperate. And then a figure appeared in the light, familiar, but not quite. It was the silhouette of a person. His parents? No, something was different. The features were blurred, shifting, as though they didn't belong to any one person. The light flickered again, and then the voice came. You can't escape. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, a truth. And the moment the words reached him, everything went silent. The light went out, and he was alone again. Trapped in the darkness, the silence was deafening. It swallowed him whole. His chest heaved, but the air felt thick, like it didn't belong to him. The cold returned, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His body trembled, unable to fight the oppressive darkness. Everything felt unreal. The light, the figure, had vanished as quickly as it appeared. Now, there was only the void, a space where time didn't exist, where he didn't exist. A low hum echoed in the distance, like a distant storm on the horizon. But there was no escape, no place to run. His mind raced, desperate for some kind of understanding. What was happening to him? What were they, his parents? What were they? A deep, unsettling ache bloomed in his chest. It was as if something important had been stolen from him, taken. The whisper returned, not in his ears, but in his mind. Don't try to fight. It wasn't a voice. It was something deeper, something that felt like it came from within him. He clenched his fists, trying to hold on to something, anything. But the grip of the darkness tightened. A strange pressure built in his skull. It was like his mind was being pulled apart, stretched thin, unraveling. He had to do something. He couldn't just let this happen. But there was nothing to fight, nothing to hold on to. The emptiness stretched forever, endless, consuming. He could feel something watching him, something always watching, lurking just outside his reach. The ground beneath him felt like it was shifting. Shifting? No, it was him. He was moving through the dark. But where? Where was he going? And why did it feel like he was sinking even deeper? The cold wasn't just around him anymore. It was inside him. His bones, his heart, his mind. The figure from before, the one in the light, lingered in his thoughts. A fleeting image, his parents' faces, but they weren't them. They couldn't be. A low growl vibrated through the air. It was a sound that wasn't a sound. It was deeper than any voice, anything. It was the sound of the void itself. It was the sound of nothing, and yet it was everywhere. In his skin, in his soul. The whisper returned, sharper this time. Welcome back. His pulse spiked. The pressure in his chest intensified. He couldn't breathe. It was too much. The darkness, no, the thing, was surrounding him now. It had always been here. He was part of it. And there was nowhere to run. The world around him twisted, bending at angles he couldn't comprehend. The darkness was no longer just something outside of him. It was in him. He could feel it crawling under his skin, curling around his thoughts. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was raw, empty. The growl from before pulsed again, deeper this time. It vibrated through his bones. He tried to move, to escape, but his limbs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. The air around him thickened, pressing down, suffocating him from every direction. "You're not alone," the whisper came again. But this time it wasn't a comfort. It wasn't a promise. It was an accusation. "You never were." The words curled around him like chains, pulling tighter. He felt his chest tighten, as if someone was squeezing the breath from his lungs. A coldness, deeper than anything he'd felt before, filled his body, rushing through his veins like ice. His vision blurred, spinning. The walls of the void bent and shifted. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. The shapes in the dark flickered and vanished as quickly as they appeared. Was it the figure again? His parents? No, it wasn't them. It was something else. Something older. The growl vibrated through the air again, louder now. It felt like the very space around him was alive, breathing, moving. And then the voices. Not just one whisper, but a chorus. A chorus of voices, soft and low, like a wind howling through an ancient tunnel. Asterisk, you are nothing. Asterisk. Asterisk, you are everything. Asterisk. Asterisk, you never belonged. Asterisk. Asterisk, you always were. Asterisk. The words echoed, crashing into his skull, repeating over and over, twisting his mind. He couldn't make sense of them. They were too much, too loud. He slammed his hands against his ears, trying to block them out. But it didn't help. They were inside him now. Every voice, every whisper, filling him up. He closed his eyes, but it didn't matter. The darkness was all he could see now. And then, a light. A flicker. So faint, it could have been an illusion. But he reached for it. He reached with all his might, fighting against the crushing weight that held him down. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For a moment, the pressure eased. The voices quieted, and he was moving again, slowly, inch by inch. The light grew brighter, a beacon in the endless night. It felt warm, comforting, but distant. So far. The coldness receded slightly, but the pressure was still there. The darkness never fully let go. The whisper returned. Don't trust it. The light flickered again. It was pulling him in. And the moment he reached for it, the space shifted again. The light vanished, and he was back in the suffocating dark. The pressure returned. Heavier now, the weight of the darkness pressed harder against him. Suffocating. Relentless. The cold was a sharp blade, cutting through his soul. Every breath he took felt like it might be his last. His mind was slipping, losing its grip on what was real and what was a nightmare. The light, so close, had vanished, leaving him in the crushing void again. The silence was broken only by his ragged breathing, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. But now something was different. There was a presence here, a weight in the air, a suffocating pressure that wasn't from the darkness itself. It was something else, something alive. His skin prickled, every nerve on edge. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. He could feel them. In the distance, a sound began to form, a low, eerie hum that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. Closer, closer. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, vibrating through the dark. It was coming for him. He tried to move, tried to push himself up, but his body was heavy, as if chained to the ground. His limbs screamed in protest, too weak to fight. And then, just beyond the reach of his fading sight, there was movement. A shadow, dark against the darker background. It was silent at first, just a shift in the air, the smallest rustle. But it grew. It grew into something more. The figure was there again, but this time it wasn't a distant silhouette. It was right there, right in front of him. He could feel the coldness radiating from it, colder than anything he had ever known. It was more than a figure. It was a presence, a force. He couldn't see its face, but he could feel its eyes on him, piercing, unblinking. It loomed over him, towering, suffocating. The whispering voices returned, swirling around him. You cannot hide. You never could. The weight of the cold on his chest began to ease, but something darker filled the space. The void became a strange kind of presence. It was alive, watching. He tried to focus, to remember something, anything, the figure, the hand, the whispers. He couldn't recall the details anymore. They were already fading, slipping through his grasp, but he could still feel the presence of them, the things that had taken him, the things that had always been here. He tried to scream again, but his voice was lost in the abyss. There was no sound, no air, no place. He was everywhere and nowhere. The darkness was all that remained, the only thing he could feel, touch, or know. The whispers came again, closer this time, as though they were in his very mind. You were always meant to join us. He couldn't tell if it was the figure or the void itself, speaking to him now. It didn't matter. There was nothing left to fight, nothing left to resist. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new understanding settled within him. This place, this cold, empty void, it wasn't something that had happened to him. It was where he belonged. The whispers grew stronger, louder now. You are one of us. The darkness began to fade, pulling away from the edges of his awareness, leaving only the soft hum of the void. And then, a flash, a glimpse of something familiar. A memory? A face? His parents? No, it wasn't them. It was the shadow of them. A fleeting image, lost again to the darkness. And then everything was quiet, still. For the first time since it all began, everything was silent. And as the last thought left his mind, the void closed in, swallowing everything whole. He was gone. And the darkness was all that remained. The stillness was overwhelming. It pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. There was no sound, no movement, nothing, only the blackness. The cold had settled into every part of him, every corner of his mind. It was as if he had never existed outside of it. The thought of anything else, of his parents, of the light, of escape, seemed distant, fading. He couldn't remember the warmth of the sun, the sound of his own voice. It had all slipped away like water through his fingers. The void had claimed him, and now it seemed it would never let go. But in the heart of this silence, a strange thing happened. A flicker, a tiny spark. It was so small, so fragile, it barely registered at first. A heartbeat? A thought? He couldn't tell. It was just there, a sudden, faint pulse of warmth in the endless cold. It didn't belong. It shouldn't be there. It didn't make sense. But it was there, a single, fragile thread. And just as quickly, the darkness seemed to notice it. It trembled. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed to pause, as if considering what to do with the spark, what to do with him. The cold around him began to shift. It wasn't as suffocating. It wasn't as complete. A sliver of warmth grew, spreading slowly, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the night. He felt something someone within it. It was faint, but unmistakable. A presence, a familiar presence. He tried to focus, to make sense of it. His mind strained, but the warmth was there. It wasn't just the void. It was something else. A voice, familiar, like a forgotten memory, whispering through the cold. You're not alone. He reached out, his hands trembling, his heart pounding. The warmth was there, just within reach. A chance, a way out. It was too soon, too fragile, but it was enough. For the first time since his descent into darkness, he felt a pull, something drawing him forward. The spark began to grow, brighter now. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the darkness seemed to yield. It wasn't gone, but it was fading, just enough to make space for something more, for hope, for something else. And in that brief moment, he understood. The darkness couldn't hold him forever. He wasn't lost. Not yet. The warmth continued to grow, wrapping around him like a cocoon. It wasn't overwhelming, not like the suffocating cold of the void. No, this warmth was different. It was soft, gentle, like a whisper of life, returning to something long forgotten. He could feel it in his chest, in his pulse. A slow beat, steady and sure. The darkness that had once consumed him was still there, but now it felt distant, faint, like a shadow retreating before the light. For the first time since he could remember, he didn't feel alone. The presence, so familiar, so tender, was there again. It wasn't an echo or a memory. It was real. The warmth pulsed again, a heartbeat that wasn't his own but felt like a part of him. And then a voice, soft but unmistakable. Come back. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was simply a truth. The warmth swelled, and suddenly he could feel his body again. His hands, his feet, his breath. The weightlessness of the void was gone. He was grounded again. His senses returned, one by one, as if he were waking from a dream. The darkness began to recede, pulling away, revealing something else. Something he couldn't quite see, but he knew was there. The edges of a place, a world, home. For a brief moment he didn't move. He simply felt the air around him, the warmth surrounding him, the absence of the suffocating cold. Then slowly opened his eyes. It wasn't the void anymore. It wasn't the darkness that had trapped him. It was a quiet place, a familiar place. He could hear the soft rustling of leaves, the distant sound of water. The sun, faint but real, touched his skin. The weight of the cold was gone, replaced by a steady calm. And in the distance he saw them, his parents, not shadows, not figures of memory. They were there waiting, not to claim him, but to welcome him. His heart lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he smiled. He was home,